So I want to do it like a little comparison between, being the administrator for a very, very large organization, very large project such as the BBC Proms,
Mm.
and maybe a smaller scale, however small that may be. Small as in you're the only person doing it.
Yes.
Because when you're because I was an administrator before.
Right.
When I was doing my bachelor's, I organized a symphonic concert
Aha.
for Ravel's Piano Concerto
Yes.
and paired with Shostakovich's Jazz Suite No. 2.
Yep.
And I was the only one doing everything. I was the I was the one liaising with the
Yes.
stage managers and
Mm.
drawing up seating plans, going to budget meetings,
Mm.
talking with photographers to take photos of my performers, contacting all of the guest instrumentalists.
Yes.
Because I couldn't go and get the reserve for the orchestra. I had to build my own orchestra from scratch.
Yes. Well, all I can say is you look pretty well on it. I'm amazed you survived because
my hair's grown back since then.
But I can reassure you that most people start that way.
Yes.
And I've recently been researching at Cambridge and looking at concerts that were put together in exactly the way you described from scratch. I never quite did that, but for me, the contrast that you described was between being a single-handed, self-motivating writer and reviewer, and then having to take on this huge bureaucracy and work out how to shift it 5 or 10 degrees.
Yes, and with lots of people in the mix as well.
Yes.
But the comparison I wanted to make was that when you're working in a big organization, you have people working with you at the same time. So that then leads to less pressure on yourself to make decisions and to see the overview of the project. So what was
not necessarily,
right?
Because
yes.
You're spending a lot of your time balancing up or adjudicating between the different views of the people who are working for you. And that is always, and particularly, I think that was true of the BBC in the old days, where it was very internally focused, and there wasn't a sufficient outward-looking view of the audience. It tended to be special interest groups clashing within the organisation because they wanted their agenda to prevail. So it was more, running the United Nations, really, than it was running a cultural organisation.
Yeah. Did that hinder process in any way or slow things down? Or
well, yes, because there was always a tendency in the BBC for people to be very enthusiastic when you suggested something.
Yes.
They would run off, and then after nothing happened, they would sort of come back and say, well, I'm really sorry, it just didn't turn out to be possible.
Right.
So getting people to have a sense of direction and to feel that things could change and to know what they were aiming at. I mean, the big thing we were trying to do was to have Radio 3 presented in a way that people could hear that those presenting it were doing so from a position of knowledge and enthusiasm. And that was quite a tricky thing. What people loved was, in the conservative side of the audience, was the Radio 3 voice that was sort of anonymous, but, was not pretending to be an expert, whereas I wanted people who were more involved and more committed.
And when you were a director, what kind of vision did you have for the music scene? What kind of things were you planning to program? What were your ambitions?
Well, I think what the ambition was that Radio 3 should remain at the heart of the cultural life of the country, that the BBC orchestras should be used to reach out to as many people as possible by giving public concerts, by becoming involved in education, and that we should find ways of celebrating this huge diversity and huge amount of achievement, while at the same time pushing the art form forward, so that the BBC's role in commissioning new music, encouraging young composers and young talent, was absolutely a key part of the life of the network. And I think, to a large extent, we did that round creating major projects. In 95, we created a whole year of British music, because that was Purcell's anniversary and Tippett's birthday. That was Fairest Isle. That was a very high-profile series. And then at the end of the 20th century, 97 to 99, we put together a series called Sounding the Century, which was really a retrospective of everything worthwhile written in the 20th century. So these were not small-scale things. They were big demonstrative projects, but I think they they succeeded in making the network noticed.
What contributes to your decision-making when it comes to a program? Does it come from what's happening in society and you try to reflect that in the program, or what goes through your decision making?
Well, there are so many factors involved in any decision like that to do with the program. But what I would say, I think me and my immediate team did very well at the proms, was not to make it a top-down exercise where we just wrote programs down on a piece of paper and handed them out to conductors and orchestras to get on with, but we had constant discussions with conductors and orchestras as to what they wanted to perform and what they thought they would be good at performing. And sometimes they were not what's the term? They were not entirely accurate in their assessment of what they would be good at, if you see what I mean. And so you had to nudge it in a certain way. But I think my aim through the whole proms period was to balance the core repertory, which we knew was what attracted 250,000 people to buy tickets for the concerts every year, to balance that up with a really vigorous approach to new works and new commissioning. And of course, that was a risk because some new pieces work and some don't. But with the proms, you have this incredibly open-minded audience that is prepared to take a punt on that, particularly if what you're also offering them in the program is something that they know they will enjoy.
So would a sort of a strategy, move on to contemporary music and trying to make that more sort of how do you say, accessible to the modern audience, contemporary audience. A lot of people, especially a lot of concert organizers that I know, they normally try to couple contemporary music with a lot more well-known composers, just so that they don't throw them into the deep end of a full contemporary concert. Is that a very effective way, do you think? Or do you think there's another way that we can do, or administrators can do, to ease people in?
I think there are many ways in which that could go. So at the proms, we certainly used that technique that you just described of putting excuse me, of putting Harrison Birtwistle alongside Beethoven 9.
Yep.
And the place would be packed and people would be exposed to Harrison Birtwistle and either enjoy it or not, but they were willing to take the risk on that, and that was marvellous. You can also create very well-made programs of entirely contemporary music. We tended to do that more in the late-night concerts of the proms, and that appeals to a particular niche audience. The thing I really learnt from my proms predecessors was that a conductor like Pierre Boulez, who was such an important figure for the BBC, he had enormous skill at placing contemporary music in the context of great pieces that helped it to make sense.
Right.
So, the background of the 20th century repertory in terms of Stravinsky, Debussy, Ravel, Bartók, and so on was a very, very important background to then putting in something absolutely contemporary. So I think there are numerous ways to go about it, but I think the important thing is to set up a trust between the promoter and the audience, that even if it turns out that in the end they don't like what it is, it will have been worth hearing. And I think that's the very important link that one has to make, and which I think the Proms does make.
Yes, and it wasn't just a haphazard decision. Just to
No.
Everything was
thought out.
Yes,
or most things.
Yes. Well, I think that's what most people who don't listen to classical music don't really understand.
No.
Sometimes, they normally think that we just throw music in together just because we like it. Some people do that. That's their choice. But sometimes people do take a lot of consideration when it comes to their program.
Yes.
It's almost like when a chef picks out his 3-course meal.
Absolutely. And remember that we're also doing that over a season as well as in a single concert.
Oh.
So the balance of what you're managing to include over a season is vital.
That's a huge puzzle, isn't it?
Yes.
So
an enjoyable puzzle.
Yes.
And of course, it fits together, the different building blocks fit together in different ways at different times. But you can be pretty sure that certain elements need to be in place, certain performers need to be in place, and then you start adding until you have something that adds up as a whole season.
I noticed that you mentioned New Yorker, the New Yorker that you work for. First of all, would you consider yourself a journalist or a music administrator, or both? What would you say you're? What are you?
Yes. I would call myself fundamentally a critic and writer about music, who has been fortunate enough to be able to put some of those things into practice as a music administrator.
Okay, gotcha.
And now, having concluded what was 30 years, really, of management, if you put together Radio 3, the Proms, and then the Barbican.
Yes.
I'm very happy to be returning to business as a sole trader, as it were, and doing writing and research on that basis. But I would not have missed the experience of being able to work with big teams of people to deliver huge events. That's very, very rewarding.